After a threatening number of comments almost forcing me to review the EX2510, here it finally is. And this monitor is a good one. But is it a Zowie or is it a BenQ? Well, no, it's a Mobiuz slotting right in between those two sub-brands, aiming to combine gaming traits and picture quality. While this is a fairly new approach for BenQ, they are kind of late to the party, as most other brands already had fast high refresh rate monitors on offer that also deliver on picture quality thanks to their IPS displays. So, let's check whether the Mobiuz can compete. I'm not a big fan of reading out specs for a few minutes straight, so I thought I'd rather put them on the screen real quick. The important bits obviously are that this is a 144Hz IPS monitor, but other than our usual 24-inch monitors, which typically are 23.8-inch screens, this comes with a slightly larger 24.5-inch panel. Now, that's obviously not something that's really noticeable difference, even when comparing both sizes side by side, like here with the Asus VG249Q. But that tells us that the Mobiuz uses a different panel, and more so, one that's not so commonly used. To be more precise, this is the M240HAN01.6 by AU Optronics. Now, that panel is surrounded by reasonably small bezels and a big chin on the bottom of the screen. And that goatee right there is an ambient light sensor, but more on that in a bit. Overall, the build quality is above average considering this is a $250 monitor. We don't get any metal parts though, but nice fit and finish with high quality plastic. And there's a cover included tidying up the cables in the back, which certainly is a neat extra. Though the clean look of the Mobiuz is interrupted by an orange piece of plastic. I wish they just made it a neutral color or didn't put it on there at all. I'm certainly not a big fan of colored accents on a monitor. However, I'm a fan of the ergonomics that this stand provides. Height, tilt and swivel can be adjusted in a wide range, basically leaving nothing to be desired. Well, unless you want to use it in portrait orientation, as the pivot adjustment is fixed. Kind of. Small adjustments are possible, but for portrait mode you'd have to mount this monitor at its VESA mount. Maybe that goatee style ambient light sensor is the reason BenQ decided not to include pivot adjustment, because they were afraid one could snap it off? I don't know. But surely having a light sensor like we used to from our smartphones sounds like a pretty good idea. However, the sensor can only be activated with the Sol code BI+ setting, which basically adjusts settings like contrast, color temperature and such automatically and blocks any manual control, so safe to say that's a no-go for me. If it would just control the brightness and nothing else, this sensor might actually have been pretty useful, but I like my other settings to be consistent and controllable. Now, after turning the monitor on, the first thing that really caught my attention was its sound, believe it or not. I usually don't give much on integrated speakers, and I'm a bit of an hi-fi nerd, as some of you might have guessed from the headphone and amp gear that's sometimes sitting on my desk. But this integrated speakers actually don't suck, which is a huge compliment to be honest. Because usually those speakers are extremely bad, especially with monitors in this price range. The Mobiuz surely doesn't replace proper speakers or headphones, but just have a listen for yourself against the popular Asus VG249Q. This little comparison surely isn't very scientific, but I think it demonstrates nicely that the Mobiuz speakers wipe the floor with the AOC. In addition to the live/pop sound profile you just heard, the Mobiuz provides two more presets. Have a quick listen. The cinema preset can be useful at times, while the game preset doesn't really make sense in my opinion. I definitely prefer the default pop/live preset. Anyway, enough about sound, let's take a look at the screen. At full brightness we get 360 nits, which is pretty bright and definitely appreciated if you're using your monitor in a bright room. At night you of course want to turn the brightness down a lot, and the EX2510 provides a very good adjustment range, down to just 50 nits. At a brightness setting of 29, we're getting our typical 140 nits. At this setting, I measured a contrast ratio of over 1200 to 1, which even exceeds BenQ's 1000 to 1 spec. So we're getting a pretty good contrast for an IPS panel, right between our typical 1000:1 panels, which are most common, but not as high as the almost 1500:1 contrast we're getting from the first version AOC 24G2 or MSI G241, which are a bit of an exception among IPS monitors. The Mobiuz surely doesn't sit in a bad spot there, exceeding the contrast of many of its competitors. And for me, the black level is deep enough to enjoy video content and do some photo editing. And even more, my unit in particular has a very good backlight uniformity. Even the exaggerated exposure looks clean, with only one brighter spot at the top left. The spots towards the corners are basically just a bit of IPS glow, as we can see them disappear when I take a photo from a much farther distance. I really hope I didn't just get a golden sample here. At least this is a plain normal retail model, which I bought myself, so BenQ didn't send this or had the chance to pre-select it. Now, when it comes to color, we're pretty much getting a standard Gamut display here. Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverages are too small to really work with, which really isn't a problem with a gaming monitor. More importantly, the sRGB color space is pretty much completely covered. And overall, the Mobiuz color range even slightly exceeds the boundaries of the sRGB color space, which is the dotted line in the green to yellow hues, meaning we get an overall slightly bigger gamut volume than sRGB, about 113% the size of that, which of course leads to slight oversaturation when viewing sRGB content, more or less limited to those green and yellow hues as we can see from the diagram. Now, I'm overall very impressed with the out-of-the-box color performance of the EX2510. Setting everything to standard or normal without any calibration gets us in a pretty good spot already. The color temperature is close to our target and the grayscale performance is pretty accurate already. The gamma curve seems to aim more for an average of 2.2 instead of the drawn-in sRGB target, but that's totally fine as well. Of course, the delta E won't be great thanks to the oversaturation as we're having an unclaimed gamut here. But delta H is ignoring that saturation stuff and is telling us that the color hues are actually pretty accurate. Meaning we might get an oversaturated green for instance, but at least it's close to the right hue. With some simple OSD tweaks, we can get the color temperature even closer to our target. And of course, performing a full calibration and profiling on top of that will give us excellent results as expected. These are the just mentioned tweaks, and you can also use them in conjunction with the ICC profile that you can download from the description down below. Alternatively, the Mobiuz also provides an sRGB mode, and to my astonishment, it's excellent. This pretty much is professional level accuracy we're getting here, so safe to say that I'm impressed. Also, this mode doesn't disable the brightness control, which is a common problem with other monitors. So if you have no problem trading in some color gamut volume, the sRGB mode is highly recommended on this monitor. Well, it does also disable many gaming related features, so if you're a big fan of those color vibrance or shadow lifting functions, you might want to give the sRGB mode a pass as well. Speaking of gaming related features, unlike its Zowie brother, the XL2411K, the Mobiuz does have adaptive sync support. AMD users will get FreeSync Premium from 48 to 144 Hz over both DisplayPort and HDMI. Nvidia didn't certify the EX2510 as G-Sync compatible, but I guess we'll never know whether it failed their certification process or whether they just didn't test it. Anyway, when using a DisplayPort cable, we can manually enable G-Sync in the Nvidia control panel. And in my testing with a 2070 Super, the G-Sync experience was absolutely flawless. I mostly play somewhat competitive FPS games, and the EX2510 really does a great job delivering a responsive and clear gaming experience. Part of that comes down to its response times, which I tested using Blurbuster's pursuit camera technique. Now, the EX2510 provides 4 different levels of overdrive, or AMA as BenQ likes to call it. AMA stands for Advanced Motion Acceleration, by the way, whatever that means. Anyway, all 4 modes look pretty good, and this is really a nicely tuned set of overdrive options. But we're gonna go with AMA2 here, as brighter parts of the image start to show slight inverse ghosting with mode 3. This is a bit of an unusual behavior, and the reason why I'm showing those brighter UFO tracks as well. Interestingly enough, the EX2510 is one of those monitors that have a slightly different set of overdrive modes, with adaptive sync turned on and off. Take a look at AMA3 for instance. Adaptive sync on, and here is off. Either way, AMA2 is the best choice, with or without adaptive sync. This is also true for 120 Hz, so console gamers want to choose AMA2 as well. Same story with 60Hz, meaning with AMA2 we got a single overdrive mode that's best throughout the refresh rate range. That's pretty handy. Now the Mobiuz also offers backlight strobing, which is called blur reduction in the OSD. And thankfully this is combinable with overdrive and it does not disable or brightness control. That's certainly something not many monitors offer. As most other monitors though, the strobing can't be used with adaptive sync. But maybe it's worth the trade-off, let's see. Again, AMA2 is the sweet spot as the highest overdrive mode starts to introduce some inverse ghosting to lighter colors. So let's put AMA2 side by side with the Zowie XL2411K, which has ATN panel, and while not perfect, this is the best strobing implementation from all the monitors I've tested so far. And its brother from another mother can actually keep up quite well. Well, until we're booting the Zowie into the factory menu and custom tune the overdrive. Nevertheless, the strobing on the Mobiuz actually is usable and far better than what we typically get. Check out the second version 24G2 for instance, which already was improved upon the first version in that regard. The AOC doesn't have a chance against both BenQs, and even more so when we factor in the maximum brightness with strobing enabled. The Mobiuz doubles the AOC's brightness and even exceeds the Zowie. Backlight strobing isn't everyone's cup of tea though, so let's pull up some comparisons without strobing. The Asus VG249Q still holds the crown when it comes to fast 24-inch IPS monitors, and actually the EX2510 manages to match its performance. Needless to say that this is an excellent result. The first version AOC 24G2 shows slightly more ghosting than the Asus and the Mobiuz. The pixels of the MSI G241 are even a bit slower than that, but to put it into perspective, even the MSI delivers a great gaming experience, especially for those who aren't too sensitive to ghosting or smearing. Now, BenQ may be a little bit late to the party when it comes to fast IPS monitors, but they really delivered on this one. The EX2510 feels polished, and there's really nothing it's particularly bad at. Even typical shortcomings we used to see with many monitors of all price ranges, like crappy speakers or inaccurate sRGB modes, are non-existent on this monitor. And if you're after the fastest IPS experience, the Asus VG249Q just got a worthy opponent, basically matching its ghosting performance. Of course, an honorable mention goes to the second version AOC 24G2, which also delivers a virtually identical motion performance, but has a lower maximum brightness than the other two. Now, against the Asus, the Mobiuz has some other advantages like its higher maximum brightness and better contrast ratio, not to mention the far better speakers and the excellent sRGB mode. The Asus usually is a few dollars cheaper though, which obviously can be the deciding factor, especially if you don't care about things like sRGB modes or higher contrast and just want a fast IPS monitor on a budget. But the Mobiuz also does a great job for content consumption and some content creation, and I prefer it over the Asus in that regard. Well, there's also the MSI G241, which has an even higher contrast ratio than the Mobiuz, but it also comes with its own drawbacks, so you may want to watch that review as well. Obviously, there are some competitors to consider that do some things a bit better than the EX2510, or at least are a bit cheaper. But overall, the Mobiuz doesn't have a real weakness, and it's good in many things and even excellent in some. Safe to say that I highly recommend this as a jack-of-all-trades monitor. Thanks for watching and consider to subscribe.